Welcome to the Rimworld mod rundown. We'll be taking a quick look at what you can expect to see from Ushanka's biological warfare. For starters, you'll need to own the additional workshop content, vanilla expanded framework, and harmony. Whilst not required, this mod does have integrations with the Anomaly DLC. It's time for another highly detailed, beautifully involved, and lovingly crafted mod by Ushanka. Biological warfare allows you to turn colony illnesses into either weapons, vaccines, or anti-serums. At first glance, it may be a touch overwhelming, much like the Luciferium expansion can be, but I'd go as far as to say that biological warfare is actually a lot more straightforward than it initially appears. So let's start with what the mod includes and why it might spark that information overload response for some players. You'll be given the ability to sample diseases, unlock 3 buildings to work with these samples, create pathogens that can be turned into vaccines, anti-serums, gas shells, grenade launchers, missile launchers, gas barrels, and gas vents, which is a lot of options to be given from a single starting point. This mod also includes a bit of gear and an implant to defend against biological warfare, and a man-made virus to help you get the ball rolling. All of this is neatly wrapped up in its own research chain, with the additional bits of gear turning up in relevant research from the main game. Now, that might not sound like a lot at first, until you take into account that a pathogen is a single disease, with the mod including 6 by default and an additional 1 if you have Anomaly installed, so you've got multiple variations for vaccines, gas shells, vents, etc. If you look at what is included in the mod as a whole, it feels very overwhelming, but if you take a step back and think of these pathogens as a different building material, it's much more manageable. The grenade launcher will work exactly the same if it's loaded with the flu as it would if it was filled with malaria. The only difference is going to be the illness that's applied and the associated stat debuff. With that in mind, it isn't going to be necessary to cover all 7 versions of each structure. They'll all operate in the same way, just with a different flavour of gas. The sleeping sickness cloud looks like it'd smell the nicest to me. I'm getting a mint original source vibe. You know, the shower gel that you don't warn guests about, so they basically end up using icy hot on their genitals if they stay over for a weekend. Let's break this down bit by bit then. Ushanka was nice enough to include a production chain on the mod page itself, so we'll work from there and then wrap up any loose ends. The first stages of this process will need us to have unlocked pathogen production, the starter research for biological warfare. This needs electricity and drug production, so it isn't even that deep in the tech tree. From there, we're going to need a sick pawn. Now, this doesn't have to be a humanoid. If you want to run a disease lab, it's actually a little bit easier to keep livestock around for this purpose. It's going to be easier if you don't name your animals as well. You won't get too attached to them that way. So we have our sick target, with valid illnesses being the flu, scaria, plague, infection, malaria, sleeping sickness, and the new illness added for Anomaly, Necroa. If you're playing with a lot of weird and wonderful modded diseases, they're unlikely to yield any results. You'll also note that these samples require a living host to create, and whilst I'm sure you could cook up some pretty nefarious illnesses by sampling a desiccated body, lung rot isn't an included option for your pathogens. So unlike Project Zomboid, corpse sickness isn't an ailment in Rimworld, it's just a mood debuff.
Hey, buddy! Down in front!
Now, to get this sample, we're going to need a new item called the Disease Sampler. This can be created at a drug lab without a hard skill requirement, costing 1 component, 15 cloth, and 5 steel. Taking just 20 work to complete 2, so it's pretty quick to get a handful of these made and they stack up to 10. These samplers are used via the right click menu, not the operations tab. The target moving around can interrupt the process, so try and target someone that is resting or draft them to keep them still if needed. A single target can also be hit with multiple samplers, so you don't need to infect everybody with the flu to get a good chunk of samples. A single target will do the job just fine. So now that we've got a sample to work with, this is where you have a bit of a split. The flu and scaria are viruses, plague and infections are bacteria, malaria and sleeping sickness are parasites, and Necroa is an archovirus. The strain of disease will determine what structure you need to turn it from a sample into a pathogen, the next stage of production. A little thing to mention is that whilst the disease is still a sample, it isn't vulnerable to temperature and can be, somehow, safely stored on a regular shelf. As long as it's got a roof and isn't outdoors, it's going to be happy. but once you turn your samples into pathogens, they'll need to be kept in a freezer to avoid degradation. The three methods for making these pathogens are the virus replicator, the bacteria incubator, and pills created at the drug lab. Each of these has a different method of producing their output, so let's go for the virus replicator first, which works on the flu, Scaria, and Necroa. Costing 60 steel, 30 silver, 10 neutro, and 3 components to build, the virus replicator works by dispersing the inserted sample into the air of the room that it's been built in, with the area shown directly around it being considered a safe zone. Consider it akin to being in a little hazmat dome. Just like taking a sample from an ill pawn, most of the interactions with these structures can work from a right-click menu, allowing you to insert the sample and activate them as needed. Infected targets will not only receive a copy of the virus, but also the modifier of virus extraction, which allows you to gather pathogens from the body post-mortem.
This is gonna cost me.
This is why livestock are handy to keep around for virus creation. You can hit a large amount of animals with a single sample and then harvest many pathogens in return. These pathogens are going to be impacted by a few variables. Body size and infection severity are the main two, so you're going to want some chonky animals that are kept indoors and left untended for the duration of the illness, so the severity ideally hits 100% and you don't end up needing to slaughter them to gain any incubated pathogens. Remember that with Scaria and Necroa, the subjects will become dangerous once the virus hits 100%, with Scaria making them berserk and Necroa turning them into a shambler. The flu will kill them outright and the corpses can still be butchered for leather and meat, it's just going to be a little bit more sweaty than normal. Whereas you'll only have a chance that some of the Scaria subjects are still in a good enough condition to consume after they've been put down, with Necroa always turning your animals into a rotten mess. This is something you'll need to deal with in a timely manner too, as any of these pathogens left on the ground in the incubation room will need putting into a freezer to be kept stable, although you could always keep the pen nice and chilly, so that you can collect them at your leisure and simply wait out any dangers. Just make sure that you aren't killing the animals with hypothermia, as they'll be dropping less pathogens than if the virus had time to hit 100%. Next up is the bacteria incubator, used to make plague and infection pathogens. This needs 80 steel, 50 silver and 4 components to build, and will also require fueling with neutro to work once it's been made. The building works on a very simple conversion rate. Each unit of Nutramine added will become 3 pathogens from the inserted bacteria sample, with a maximum of 60 neutro loaded at once, giving a single sample the potential to become 180 pathogens. This process will always take 8 hours of incubation, regardless of the fuel level, so it's best to top it up when possible and get the most value from each cycle. That then leaves the parasite samples, malaria and sleeping sickness. These don't have a structure of their own to work with, instead requiring the drug lab to synthesize them into pills. You will have bills available to make either singles or quads, with each dose requiring a single sample and 6 neutro, no discounts for multi-crafting. Now that you've got these pills, you're going to need a subject to take them to host the parasite for a while. Ideally a large tame animal, as this does require a medical procedure to administer. The only option in the right click menu is for the selected colonist to consume them, and you probably don't want that. Whilst the parasite is active in the host body, it experiences accelerated growth and reproduction rates, causing samples to burst out of the body violently, leaving wounds that will require tending. So you likely want the animal set to tend without medicine, meaning that they won't bleed out from their injuries, but they also don't get to fight off the infection too quickly from a high quality tend. You could always use these on unwavering prisoners, of course. So now that you've got your array of pathogens, it's time to do something with them. And I know there's still some bits left in pathogen production that we haven't covered yet. Don't worry, we'll get around to those eventually. Of the 7 pathogens created, one of them works a little differently, and that's the wound infection variety. You can see in the research tree that flu, Scaria, plague, malaria, sleeping sickness and Necroa all have a 400 point project to research, whereas wound infection only has the antibody research for 2400. You can't turn wound infections into an offensive tool, but to make up for this, you're given the option of a man-made atrocity, the Fleshbreaker chemical. All of these 400-point researches will unlock the ability to reverse engineer a sample of the illness as well as the tools to weaponize it, into gas barrels, vents, grenades, missiles, and shells. I know it looks like a lot to unlock in a single step, but just think of it as getting 6 items in a variety of colours. They all work exactly the same way, they're just made with a different pathogen, so you'll likely only need to unlock the ones that you have the easiest access to. Let's cover the reverse engineering aspect first. If you're starting to run low on pathogens and haven't thought too far ahead as to how you're going to get more, this will allow you to swap a pathogen back into a sample. So you could insert a virus into the replicator again, make a fresh batch of parasite pills, or incubate another stack of bacteria. There is also the new man-made option, Fleshbreaker, costing 2 neutro per dose. Unlike other procedures at the drug lab, this does have a stat requirement, 4 crafting and 6 intellectual. Any idiot can scrape snot from a vial onto a sheet of cloth, but actually making a pathogen requires a little bit more know-how. So far, not too bad, right? That entire step looks overwhelming, but it's actually just a fallback to make sure you don't totally exhaust your stockpile and run out of your war crime potential. From here we've got the gas barrels and the gas vents, which also ties back into a structure from pathogen production research, the gas vent controller. You'll find the barrels and vents in the security tab and the controller in miscellaneous. The barrels are the most straightforward approach to dispersing your virus, costing nothing but pathogens to build, either 15 doses of Fleshbreaker or 75 for flu, scaria, plague, malaria, sleeping sickness and necroa. You don't even need to pay for the actual barrel that it's stored inside. Nice. The barrels are extremely volatile, requiring only the slightest tap of damage to trigger their fuse, before erupting in a huge cloud of the contained illness. The cloud sticks around for the same amount of time regardless of if it's indoor, outdoor, roofed or unroofed, so you don't need to make an elaborate tox box setup to try and choke attackers. These will work just the same if they're placed in an open field. It'll just be harder to keep raiders locked down and running through the gas cloud. Whilst the gases all last around the same amount of time, not all illnesses are created equally. Against xenotypes without any toxic resistance, most will reach critical mass in around 20 seconds of exposure, so a single barrel explosion can result in anywhere from a 40 to 100% impact, depending on the pathogen cloud density per tile. Whilst the flu, plague, malaria and sleeping sickness will just outright kill the target, scaria can turn them berserk, creating infighting and tying up any ranged attackers, and necroa will eventually turn its victims into shamblers. Again, very useful for grabbing other attackers' attention and causing infighting. Just make sure that you're ready to deal with the remaining shamblers yourself, as their attacks will be infecting their targets with more necroa, potentially spiraling and leading into a zombie horde.
Is it clear?
No.
How many?
Lots.
Fleshbreaker is the only non-lethal gas that you can deploy, but it's no less savage. Its initial stage lasts all the way up to 60% severity, lasting progressively more hours as it builds, impacting consciousness by 10%, sight by 15%, and digestion by 30% to begin with. Once it reaches 60%, it becomes pounding. That increases pain to 115%, lowers consciousness by 15%, sight by 35%, blood filtration, pumping and breathing by 10%, digestion by 60%, and increases hunger rate and tiredness by 150%. Anyone under the full effect of this drug also has the potential to experience a vertigo pulse, wandering around in a dizzy state. So whilst it would be quicker to outright kill any raiders with the flu, you'll never get any prisoners that way. Fleshbreaker makes it easy to face and down your attackers, potentially netting you some more recruits. Every barrel that you destroy will drop a few pathogens after dispersing its payload, so you'll get a bit of a leg up in building another to replace it. These barrels don't automatically rearm though, so make sure you're keeping an eye on what's been triggered at the end of a raid, so you can restock your defences as required. The gas vents are a more long-term solution than the barrels. but they will require restocking with pathogens once activated, and good lord do they get through their fuel quickly. Each vent will cost 30 steel, 1 component and 50 pathogens to make, with Fleshbreaker dropping the price down to 10 instead. Whilst these vents don't require power to work, if you want a safer and easier way to activate them, you're going to need to hook them up to a power grid that has a connected gas vent controller. You'll already have unlocked this from the pathogen production research. It costs just 15 steel and 2 components, consuming 30 watts of power, and it'll allow you to remotely trigger individual gas vents, or all of them, as long as they're connected to the same power network. The biggest difference between using the vents against the barrel is how the gas is spread. A barrel exploding is a single, large AoE release of gas. This eruption can be blocked by walls, so it gets the most mileage out of being left out in the open, spreading the cloud as wide as possible. The gas vents, on the other hand, are pushing the cloud, as it were, able to spread through winding corridors from a relatively safe position right at the far end, forcing attackers to walk through a wave of miasma before reaching their intended target. Well worth mentioning that gas isn't heat. As such, it's blocked by things like vents, so raiders may try to get to your gas vents as they'll need to be unobstructed and they aren't particularly strong structures. Just like how raiders will frequently go for your coolers, because they're weaker than the walls and offer the quickest path into the base. Just like barrels, the gas is dense and will travel just fine even without a roof locking it in. Whilst triggering all gas vents at once will give you a solid amount of saturation down an entire walkway, it's well worth considering firing them off in sequence, so the gas stays around for longer. Unleashing 4 vents at once will inflict significantly less buildup than you get from firing them off individually and letting each cloud apply its full buildup in turn. If you're using a particularly long corridor, you might want 2 individual circuits so you can trigger salvo 1, let it take effect, then drop the second dose. Don't get me wrong, this stuff is not cheap to use, but against the majority of xenotypes it is an instant win, especially if your own colonists are immune to its effects.
Yeah, pointers.
Also unlocked with these research projects are grenade launchers if you have gunsmithing, missile launchers if you have rocket swarm, and gas shells if you have mortars. The base cost of the grenade launchers is always 75 steel and 4 components, with varying costs depending on the payload. Fleshbreaker needs 15 pathogens, Flu and Necroa need 50 pathogens, and Malaria, Plague, Scaria and Sleeping Sickness all need 75. Honestly, I'm not sure why there's a variance between the normal pathogens here. Stat-wise, they're closer to an EMP launcher than something like a Tox Bomb, as they have a 3.5 second cooldown and aiming time, compared to the longer cooldown of a standard toxic gas. Unlike the normal launchers, all bioweapon launchers suffer from a reduced direct hit chance and a higher miss radius, but because they don't need refueling or rearming, they become easily the most cost-efficient way of using your biological weaponry. Of course, the major downside to this is going to be the range, the requirement to put a colonist in harm's way to utilise them, and the smaller area of effect compared to something like a barrel or a vent. If you're using a relatively close range killbox entrance with a forced choke point, this can easily keep the access fully saturated, with just a single user targeting the ground though, making it extremely effective against most human raids. Your rocket swarm turret options when compared to the standard turret have a few differences. They have a lower base shooting accuracy, a slightly lower firing rate, smaller burst count, a lower direct hit chance and a greater miss radius, but the biggest difference is their inverted range and the change to firing style. Whilst a standard rocket swarm launcher has a max range of 30, the gas missile launchers instead have a dead zone of 30, with their range being 81. To avoid hitting obstructions when firing over these long distances, the gas launchers operate like a burst mortar, lobbing projectiles over walls, trees, chunks and anything else that may be in the way, compared to the rather blunt, flat aggression of a rocket swarm salvo. Unlike the variants on the grenade launchers, the swarm launchers are more standardised in their cost, with a 200 steel, 20 plasteel, 2 component base, and either 225 pathogens for normal illnesses or 45 for Fleshbreaker. Reloads are a little cheaper fortunately, with normal pathogens needing 150 and Fleshbreaker costing 30 to refill the launcher for another round of bombardment. That just leaves the mortar shells, which work about as you'd expect, replacing the effect of a standard shell with a cloud of contagion. Your Fleshbreaker shells will set you back 3 doses and 15 steel per round, with all other pathogens needing 15 doses to go with that 15 steel. The shells also disperse slightly more gas per round than a grenade launcher, though not quite as much as a barrel would. When compared pound for pound in the cost, however, the mortar shells are pretty damn cost efficient. You just need to make sure that you've got a good operator to offset the potentially awful accuracy, as you really don't want to be throwing these things away and wasting them.
I got him! Damn, I missed him!
And now, finally, we can go back to the antigen analyzer structure, way back from pathogen production research. The only way you'll be able to complete the antibody research projects in the tech tree is by using this device. It costs 80 steel, 30 silver, 20 gold and 5 components to build, so it isn't exactly cheap, but it's very likely to be a requirement if you're going to mess around with bioweapons, as your own colonists will be susceptible to any misfires, pathing errors or tantrums that happen to release deadly illnesses within your base. You can place a sample, the basic part of the production chain, into an analyzer, and it will allow an intellectual colonist to conduct research at it, eventually unlocking the antibody tech related to the sample that was inserted. You will need to have completed the prerequisite virus tech at a standard bench beforehand for this to start working though. That also means that once you've got all 7 antibody projects completed, you're safe to deconstruct the building and recoup a little bit of that material cost. You also don't need to worry about antibody research for the Fleshbreaker chemical, because it's non-lethal. The only thing it takes to recover from its effects are a bit of time. The antibody technologies will unlock you the final parts of the mod directly related to the pathogens, anti-serums and vaccines. You'll have a build to make these individually or as a stack of 4. Again, there's no discount for crafting multiples, so it's entirely on you as to how you want to go about creating these. Surprisingly, you don't actually need any crafting or intellectual skill to make these items at the drug lab. Simply combining it with other materials will let it work its magic. Vaccines are produced by mixing 1 penoxycillin, 25 pathogens and 8 neutro. These vaccines are designed to be taken before coming into exposure with the associated pathogen. So if you know you're likely to come into contact with the flu virus based on the weaponry you're using for the next fight, having your melee fighters pop these will keep them safe inside the gas cloud. But the vaccine will do nothing to fight off a pre-existing case of the illness. So this is your option of preventative care. The effect of these vaccines won't last forever, just like the flu shot in real life, so if you want to go the route of injections for permanent immunity, you'll need to be topping up your colonists every 8 days, which can be scheduled in the drug tab. Remember that penoxycillin blocks infections, malaria, sleeping sickness and the plague as standard anyway, so there is very little need to spend additional resources to focus its impact against only one of these effects for the small bonus of it lasting 3 additional days. The only vaccines you really need are for the flu, scaria and necroa. The anti-serums are there as a curative care method, costing 25 pathogens, 6 neutro and 1 glitter world medicine. They're a little harder to produce, and that's for good reason. These provide immediate immunity to the pathogen used in its creation, so if you get caught on the back foot, as enemies can use these biological weapons too, and end up with a nasty stack of plague on your entire colony, this is a surefire way to keep everybody alive. Equally useful to have around if you do manage to get a prisoner or two that's been a little bit drowned in miasma during combat. This will stop them slipping away before you have a chance to recruit them into your cult of contagion.
I think I might be coming down with something too.
Are you kidding me, dude? Like, I think you're gonna die.
So what are the main weaknesses of these biological weapons? Toxic resistance. Any pawn with a resistance over 80% to environmental effects will be entirely safe from the gases. That means, not counting the litany of modded xenotypes you may have, wasters and sanguiphages won't need any additional help to shrug off these effects, with hussars halving the build-up thanks to their partial antitoxic lungs. To give all xenotypes a chance against these weapons, the mod includes a couple of solutions that you can make use of. The respirator mask is unlocked alongside the normal gas mask. I'm talking as if you have biotech, of course. That's at the machining research. So whilst a face mask from complex clothing will halve the impact of any of these pathogen gases, you will need either the respirator or the gas mask to provide that 80% protection that will keep you completely safe from all buildup. These two masks do serve a slightly different purpose too, with the gas mask covering your whole head and providing a little bit of protection in combat, whereas the respirator provides absolutely zero protection values in combat, but only covers the jaw, which allows you to equip it alongside something like a flak helmet to grant yourself a higher amount of sharp armour to the head slot. If you would rather go for implants over wearing gear, you would unlock the Iron Lung with bionic research, providing 60% environmental resistance for each one that's installed, so you're going to need a pair to nullify the effect of toxic gases. Of course, if you have biotech, these fill the same role as a detoxifier lung, just at a cheaper price point. The detoxifier kidneys are potentially the better option though, as a pair of those provides complete toxic resistance, not just environmental. Something you need to consider when fighting enemies with these weapons is the gear that they are wearing to your tile. If you live in a polluted biome, you're going to be forcing them into wearing masks to visit you, meaning that they'll be entirely immune to your tactics before they knew you plan to use them. So whilst wasters do make it very easy to employ these weapons offensively, you're going to struggle to make good use of their pollution buff alongside it without essentially granting enemies a huge heads up about your shady tactics. And that is biological warfare. It may look like a lot of buttons and new toys, but for the most part it's 7 or 8 versions of the same thing, so you don't need to panic too much about information overload, as using all of the pathogens honestly isn't necessary. You can pick whichever one is the most reliable to get a hold of and replicate it as needed. A virus if you have a large amount of livestock, bacteria if you've got an excess of neutro, or a parasite if you've got more free time and space in your schedule to micromanage a little bit with medical procedures. All in all, a well-balanced approach to combat with biological weapons with a few options you can tweak in the settings of the mod too, either increasing or decreasing the progression of illnesses within the clouds, capping the infections, or disabling the arcavirus if you want shamblers to go back to normal, removing the risk of zombification. This whole approach fits quite nicely, in that it's expensive and work intensive enough that you can't simply use it for every colony you build, whilst also not being so late game focused that it becomes a win more button if you decide to use it. And whilst you could use it against every single raid if you stuck to grenade launchers and didn't branch out into the other options that need refueling, like vents or rocket swarm launchers, you're likely going to end up paying for it in vaccines and anti-serums if you aren't keeping a very close eye on your grenadiers at all times. Thanks for watching folks. If you have any mods you'd like to see a full breakdown for, or suggestions of mods you'd like to see covered, feel free to leave them in the comments, I might get around to them. I'll be back again soon with another Rimworld mod rundown. Wherever you are in the world, enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon or evening. Take care.